Since Donald Trump nominated him for Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth has faced a slew of allegations from the deep state of sexual assault, alcohol abuse, and public misconduct. Kevin Roberts is the president of Heritage Foundation, and he wrote this on X. Don't be fooled. These last-minute allegations against Pete Hegseth are a deep state playbook we've seen many times. It's always used against nominees who will bring much-needed reform to the swampy business-as-usual D.C. Senate Republicans should file cloture and confirm him, especially considering these allegations have already been disputed. Americans and free people across the world need him in office now. Well, Kevin Roberts joins us right now. So, Kevin, thanks so much for coming on. Now, this is a perfect example of why we wanted to start the mandate, to expose stuff like this. So, how does the deep state try to disrupt these confirmation hearings?
Well, they rarely go through the front door. That is to say, Jill, they rather rarely come right out and say that something is so explicitly wrong with a nominee, or if they try to do that and it doesn't succeed, they don't really double down because they're not transparent. And so what they do is work through interlocutors. They work through Democrats. Unfortunately, they sometimes work through Republicans. And look, it isn't just about nominees to be cabinet secretaries. This is also about members of the deep state in the last weeks of the Biden-Harris regime burrowing in from politically appointed positions in the administration into career positions, thereby making it more difficult to get rid of them, which would be very justified. Let me just be really clear that as it relates to soon-to-be Secretary Hegseth, a vote against Pete Hegseth is a vote for the deep state globalists. It's really that simple. The reason they're opposed to him is because he would bring much-needed reform to an agency that is desperate for it.
Kevin, it is a great day to be an American, notwithstanding this nonsense. And a lot of people are paying attention for the first time to things like confirmation hearings. There's more attention now on what is going on in Washington, D.C. than there has been in many years. So it's a good time for you to walk us through what the point of this is supposed to be and why we have confirmation hearings in the first place.
Our founders intended, as you know, Matt, for the advice and consent role of the Senate to be temporary, to be short, to not become the circus that it often is. And of course, I think every single founder, if they were alive today, would be horrified by what they're seeing, where the advice and consent role of the Senate has been taken by the Senate and exploited to be used against the executive branch, as opposed to its original intent, which is to provide some bit of accountability for these appointees. In other words, when the president is appointing well-qualified men and women to these roles, then the assumption is that the president gets his prerogative. And in this case, what's happening is that you see the typical performative theater of the DC deep state, where some of these senators do something that's sort of innocent but time-consuming, and that is ask a really short question in the form of a very long monologue about something that they think will help them back home. But the particularly nefarious part of this new modern version of the advice and consent role of the Senate is that it's used to undermine very well qualified men and women. That's precisely the kind of thing that's getting in the way of needing to do the work of the American people, particularly when you think about the need to have a Secretary of Defense in office right now.
Well, let's use Pete Hegseth still as the example. He advanced through his vote today. He got a 51-49 majority there. Collins and Murkowski were no votes, but Mitch McConnell somehow was a yes vote. So we are going to expect to see Pete Hegseth go up for that ultimate vote sometime before tomorrow night. So just take us through this process and what this is, like just the step-by-step here as people can expect to see this going forward.
I'll give you some inside baseball from the non-DC insider, just a little bit of knowledge I've gained in my few years running Heritage. And that is that today's vote, the 51-49 vote, is a procedural vote. It's the last step, as you said, Jill, to the actual vote that I think is very likely to confirm him. And it's a minor win for Mr. Hegseth. I disagree with Senators Murkowski and Collins about their vote, but I'm very grateful that Senator McConnell on the procedural vote voted for Mr. Hegseth. That's something that the DC chattering class didn't think would happen. And hopefully Mr. McConnell keeps that vote in the same direction on Friday, it's very likely that by 9:15, 9:30 p.m. on Friday, that we're going to have a confirmed Secretary of Defense. And it's very likely that he's going to report to the office right then and there. That's something that none of the DC chattering class is ready for. It's also very likely that the subsequent hearings for the nominees to be Deputy Secretary and the other Senate confirmed positions need to move expeditiously. I think Majority Leader Thune is ready to do that. Ultimately, this is what I'm driving at. Once Mr. Hegseth is confirmed, then it's Katie bar the door when it comes to reforming the Pentagon, actually in the name of American defense. That's the irony of all of this, is that this performative theater of the deep state is actually making Americans less safe as we wait for the secretary to be confirmed.
One of the things that's striking about this tactic that you're pointing out is that even if you said, well, okay, we're going to play politics, we don't care whether the candidate is qualified or not, we just disagree with them, you could at least come out and say what you disagree with, right? I mean, it strikes me that this is similar to Brett Kavanaugh. We've seen this in the past. Maybe you have some thoughts about Tulsi and what might go on there. But it is not kind of a veil, right? I mean, they're not even talking about the political disagreements in the open.
You know, Matt, you and I are both parents, and I often observe politics through the lens of a dad. And in particular, one of the things my wife and I teach our kids never to do, which is to be passive aggressive, because it's just a terrible attribute of someone. Basically, most of DC insiders are passive aggressive. That is to say, they aren't courageous enough to come right out and say what they disagree with regarding a nominee. That would be fair game, right? That's actually part of the advice and consent of the Senate. And what's interesting is that some of the best members of the Senate in our country's history, both Republicans and Democrats, have expressed their disagreement and often still voted for the nominee because they understand the executive deserves his prerogative. But all of that to say, I think that Hegseth gets through. I think that Tulsi Gabbard is going to have an equally difficult path to confirmation. Of course, we at Heritage believe that she ought to be confirmed. The hearing probably already should have happened. I think Mr. Kennedy also has among the more difficult paths. We're paying close attention to Senator Kennedy, or Senator Cassidy, I should say, of Louisiana, who's been a little tepid in his support of Mr. Kennedy. I understand that there are some kind of outdated conservatives in D.C. who are opposed to Mr. Kennedy. And yet Mr. Kennedy, I think, has expressed that he's going to hire people in his Department of Health and Human Services who will be very pro-life. And also it's an extraordinarily conservative position to be saying we're going to get big pharma money out of D.C. But you see, the problem in D.C. as it relates to Mr. Kennedy is that so many organizations, including some quote unquote conservative ones, are funded by big pharma. And so in addition to getting these great men and women confirmed, we also need to understand that so doing would begin to break the backs of K Street. And that's just something that not a lot of people in DC are willing to see.
Amazing. And yet it seems to be happening, and you seem to be optimistic. What would you say about the larger problem here in terms of confirmation and this sort of subterfuge on the part of the deep state? How do we change this so that we don't have these ridiculous gotcha moments in confirmations hearings in the future? What needs to change?
Well, it starts with leadership, and you're seeing it obviously at the executive level with President Trump and his wonderful vice president. You're also seeing great leadership by Majority Leader Thune, and very respectfully towards him. I'm slightly surprised by that, not because I thought he was incapable of it, but I thought ideologically he might be just a little out of step with this new Trumpian conservatism, and he deserves 100% A+ thus far in his management of it. And all of that to say, if Senator Thune is able to understand the moment, which is that we have to return to constitutional order, which is that the executive gets his prerogative, then I think you're going to see other potential leaders step up, whether they be in the executive branch or the legislative branch. But ultimately, what is the most important factor in this, Matt, is that the American people continue to pay attention. It's wonderful that with your show and with the great work of the Blaze generally, you're keeping pedal to the metal. Now is not the time to be asleep. Now is not the time to not be worried about politics and policy. The popular will that's put a wind in the sails of Trump and Vance and John Thune and Mike Johnson on the House side can be sustained if we, the people, continue to be involved. Senators will tell you that they don't really listen to pressure from the outside. But I can tell you, often organizing that pressure from the outside, that it works.
Well, Kevin, I think that you echoed just exactly what Matthew and I have been talking about since we were in D.C. for the inauguration, and just a sense of renewed optimism. My last question for you before we let you go here is, what are you the most optimistic about, right? This is a brand new time for our country, it feels like, where we actually have an opportunity to go through and make some real substantive changes. So what is at the top of your list that you want to see get done?
Well, I'm excited about almost every cabinet appointee, and I could give you specifics from each of those agencies. You know, Jill, I'm an educator, so I'm real interested in seeing the education department dismantled. The appointee I'm most interested in terms of what he's going to do is Russ Vought at the Office of Management and Budget. He's got what seems to the average person to be a boring job, and Russ is perfectly fine to work behind the scenes, but he is vital to this entire effort, whether it's in education or foreign policy or defense or agriculture, because the director of the Office of Management and Budget has the potential, and Russ certainly has the ability to do this, to change the trajectory of the growth of the federal government and the expense of our federal budget. If he succeeds in doing that, and I think that he will, then what we're going to see is not just the right sizing of government, but we're going to see in the long term the revitalization of the American civilization in architecture, in art, in education, in everything. We ought to be thinking with that kind of aspirational vision when we're connecting what's happening in the short terms with confirmation hearings with the long term. I couldn't be more excited about the potential, provided that the American people continue to be tuned in.